All right, so now we're going to start to work on the search form. I want to have a form above here that we can type in and we can search for users based on their usernames. So let's create a new file under components and then in users, and we'll call this search.js. And let's do RCE for a class-based component. And let's just add the markup first so that we can show the form. So I'm going to put in a form. We don't need an action. I'm going to put a class name of form because I have some predefined styles. And in here, let's put an input with the type of text. I'm also going to give this the name of text. And let's give it a placeholder. And for the placeholder, let's just say search users. Okay, and then we need a submit button. So I'm going to go underneath here and say input with the type of submit. And the value, we'll just say search. And then let's give this a class name of BTN. Let's do BTN-dark, which will just make it a dark color, and then BTN block, which will make it block level and reach all across the container. So let's save that, and we're going to bring that into app.js. So let's go right here, and I'll just copy this down, and we'll bring in search. Let's say search, and let's put this right above users. All right, so we'll save that, and if we take a look, now we have this little search form. Okay, it's not going to do anything. It doesn't do anything at all because we have no event or anything like that. Now, when we have a form in React, usually we're going to want to attach state to the input. So for instance, we have an input here for text, for the search text. So I'm going to create state object, and I'm going to have a field for text, which is going to be empty by default. And then what I'll do is set the value of this input down here to this.state.text. Now, if I save this and I go back, I actually can't type in here. Okay, and the reason for that is because it's a controlled component. Basically, we have to have an onChange event for when we type something in here. It needs to fire off and it needs to update the state. Because remember, this input is now attached to this state. So what we need to do is add an onChange, and I'm going to set that to fire off a method called this.onChange. And then we'll create that up here. So we'll say onChange, and we're going to make this an arrow function. And this takes in an event parameter. Okay, now for this onChange, we want to set the state. So remember, we use this.setState in class-based components, and we want to set the state, so where we want text to be set to whatever we type in, and we can access that with that event parameter and then e.target.value. All right, so if I do that, if we save that, now I can type inside here, and if I go to my React DevTools and we look at our search form and we look in the state, notice that whatever is in the text box is now in that state, that piece of state. Okay, so this is not a piece of state that we want to be app level. It's just relative to the component itself. Okay, so even when we implement context, or if we were to use Redux, when you have forms, your form inputs are going to be component level state. Now, there's a little trick here. I mean, we could leave it like this just because we only have one input field or one text field, but let's say we had like name, email, address, whatever. If we had a bunch of different fields, we don't want to have a separate onChange for each one and then have, you know, email or whatever. So what I usually do, and what you'll see a lot, is you'll use whatever the name is. So you can see we have a name that equals text. So here we can use brackets if we want to use this as a key, and we can get the name with e.target.name. So that'll do the same thing. It will use text because that's what we have as a name. If we had email as a name, we could still use the same on change because this would then be email for that input. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And since we only have one expression right here, we don't even need to have these curly braces. We can just directly return it like that. Okay, so that's going to update the component state with the form. Now we're going to want an onSubmit because right now we can just enter text into the field. So let's add to the form right here an onSubmit, and let's set that to a method called this.onSubmit, and we'll put this right here. Now since we want to use an arrow. Actually, I want to show you something real quick. If you don't use an arrow function, let's see, so we'd have to do E, and since it's an onSubmit, on a form tag, we have to do E.prevent default, just like you would in regular JavaScript, or else it's just going to submit to a file. So let's do a console log of, let's say, this.state.text. Now, if I go ahead and I submit, we're going to get an error. It says cannot read state of undefined. What it means is this is undefined. By default, if we don't use an arrow function, we have to explicitly bind this to this function. And the way that we can do that is where we have our submit right here, this.onSubmit, we would have to do .bind and then pass in this. All right, so if I were to do that and we click submit, let's go to our console. Now it works. Now I don't want to have to do .bind this, so to not have to do that, we can simply make this an arrow function, just like this. Okay, so now I can go ahead and submit, and it console logs it. We don't get that error. And it's just because arrow functions, this keyword works different with arrow functions. All right, so generally you want to use arrow functions here. All right, so right now we're able to enter stuff into the text input. We're able to submit and console log. Right now we're just console logging the text. But what do we actually want to do? We want to take the text that's submitted, right? And we want to call a method that's going to reach out to the API to GitHub and actually search for a user. So we're going to get into that in the next video.